The rain began shortly after 4 o'clock, though in Blackthorn Hollow, the weather was always spoken of as though it possessed intentions rather than patterns. By dusk, the storm had settled over the village with a kind of deliberate hostility, swallowing the narrow lanes beneath curtains of silver rain and bending the hedgerows until they seemed to whisper among themselves. The church bell struck 6 somewhere beyond the mist, slow and hollow, its sound dissolving almost immediately into the wind rolling across the marshes. From the windows of the Hare and Lantern Inn, warm amber light spilled weakly onto the soaked cobblestones, where puddles trembled beneath every gust. Inside, the villagers had gathered earlier than usual, driven less by sociability than by the old instinct that storms were best endured collectively. There was the soft clink of glasses, the rustle of damp coats drying by the fire, and beneath it all, the quiet rhythm of village conversation, restrained, repetitive, comfortable in its familiar boundaries. Yet that evening something restless moved beneath the ordinary. Mrs. Ellis, who kept the post office and rarely exaggerated anything, stood near the hearth with both gloved hands wrapped tightly around her teacup. "I tell you," she said for the 3rd time, lowering her voice despite the weather roaring outside, there was a light in the Vale Cottage window. No one answered immediately. The silence itself carried meaning. At the far corner table, old Mr. Pritchard lifted his eyes only briefly before returning them to his whiskey. A younger man gave a dismissive laugh that sounded far too quick to be genuine. Even the innkeeper paused while polishing a glass. The Vale Cottage. People in Blackthorn Hollow did not like speaking of it directly. They referred to it the way one referred to unpleasant memories or inherited shame, cautiously, and only when necessary. The cottage stood alone at the edge of Blackthorn Lane beyond the marsh road, half hidden behind twisted yew trees and wild climbing ivy. Once, many years ago, it had belonged to Eleanor Vale, a widow whose quiet beauty had slowly faded into something haunted after the disappearance of her little boy. The child had supposedly drowned in the marshes during an autumn storm remarkably similar to this one. Afterward, Eleanor herself had become a figure of village discomfort. Curtains twitched when she passed. Conversations ended abruptly. Then, one winter, she vanished entirely. The cottage had remained locked ever since. Or so people said. "You probably saw lightning," muttered Reverend Ashcombe gently, though his fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. Mrs. Ellis shook her head. "It wasn't lightning. It moved." The fire crackled sharply. Outside, wind battered the inn windows hard enough to rattle the panes. Then the door burst open. Young Daniel Mercer stumbled inside, breathless, rainwater streaming from his coat. He could not have been more than 14, pale-faced and trembling, not from cold, but from genuine terror. "They've found someone," he gasped. At the cottage, every conversation stopped. For one suspended instant, only the storm could be heard. "Who?" demanded the innkeeper. Daniel swallowed. "Mr. Pembroke." A chair scraped violently backward. Adrian Pembroke was not merely known in Blackthorn Hollow, he was woven into its structure, solicitor, benefactor, advisor to half the village families, a man whose polished manners and measured smile inspired trust almost automatically. Dead. The word itself seemed impossible. Within minutes, lanterns were lit and coats pulled hastily over shoulders. Men ventured unwillingly into the storm while the women remained clustered near the inn windows, watching darkness swallow the bobbing lantern lights one by one. Blackthorn Lane appeared almost spectral beneath the rain. Mud sucked greedily at boots. Bare branches clawed against the sky like skeletal fingers. And there, beyond the leaning iron gate, stood the cottage itself, the Vale Cottage. Its upper window glowed faintly amber. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the front door hung partially open, swaying gently in the wind. Inside, the air felt unnaturally still. The sitting room was small and shadowed, preserved strangely by time. Dust clung to the bookshelves and faded curtains, yet certain details appeared disturbingly recent. A chair slightly angled toward the fireplace, ashes fresh enough to retain warmth, and on the small oak table beside the hearth, a porcelain teacup from which a thin curl of steam still rose. Adrian Pembroke lay near the fireplace rug. He looked less like a murdered man than a gentleman interrupted mid-sentence. One hand rested against his chest, the other stretched outward as though reaching for balance before collapsing. His silver hair remained immaculate despite death. Only his eyes betrayed anything terrible, wide open, fixed upon the ceiling in frozen astonishment. Rain hammered against the windows. No one spoke for several moments. Then Constable Reeves frowned slowly toward the door. "It was locked," he said quietly. "Locked?" asked Reverend Ashcombe. "The sitting-room door." Reeves looked unsettled now. "We forced it open." The men exchanged uncertain glances. There were no shattered windows. No visible sign of intrusion. The old cottage windows had been nailed shut years ago from the inside, and yet Adrian Pembroke had somehow entered. A faint scent lingered beneath the dampness of the room. Lavender. Subtle, old-fashioned, almost feminine. Reverend Ashcombe removed his spectacles slowly, staring at the body with visible strain. "Dear God," he whispered. Outside, another figure had just arrived quietly at the lane entrance. An elderly woman, wrapped neatly in a dark coat, her intelligent eyes calmly surveying the cottage through the rain before moving toward the gathering crowd with patient, almost absent-minded curiosity. Few noticed her immediately. Most were too busy staring at the dead man inside the locked room. It was not until much later, after the body had been taken away and villagers began retreating uneasily toward the inn, that young Daniel Mercer tugged nervously at Constable Reeves' sleeve. "There was someone else," he whispered. Reeves looked down impatiently. "What are you talking about?" The boy glanced toward the darkened upper window of the cottage, his face drained of color. "After they found him," he said shakily, "I saw a woman standing there." The constable frowned. "What woman?" Daniel's voice dropped almost to nothing. "The gray lady." Behind them, high above in the abandoned cottage window, the curtain moved very slightly, as though someone had just stepped away from the glass. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Village. By morning, Blackthorn Hollow had not truly recovered from the storm. It had merely rearranged its silence. The rain had ceased sometime before dawn, but its absence did not bring relief. Instead, it left behind a heavy, damp stillness, as though the air itself had been rinsed of certainty. The cobblestones still glistened black beneath a reluctant gray sky, and the hedgerows sagged under the weight of collected water, each leaf trembling faintly whenever the wind stirred. Inside the village, doors opened more slowly than usual. Curtains were drawn back with hesitation rather than curiosity. People stepped outside not with purpose, but with the uneasy awareness that something had shifted in ways not yet fully understood. At the inn, the fire had been rebuilt, though it struggled against the morning chill. Conversations rose and fell in uneven fragments, never settling into anything resembling normality. "They say he was lying just there," murmured Mrs. Ellis, though she had already said it twice to different listeners. "No forced entry," someone replied, as if repeating it might eventually make it sensible. "And the cottage?" asked another voice. And no one answered immediately. The Vale Cottage had always been more than a building in Blackthorn Hollow. It was a boundary between what was spoken of and what was quietly avoided. Now it had crossed that boundary again, dragging a dead man with it. Miss Marple sat near the window of the inn parlor, her hands folded neatly in her lap, observing without interruption. She had arrived the previous evening to visit an old school friend who lived just beyond the village green, though even she could not ignore the peculiar tension that now threaded through every conversation like an unseen wire. She said little. She rarely needed to. People she knew revealed far more when they were trying to appear as though they were merely reporting facts. "It's the cottage," Reverend Ashcombe said at last, standing near the hearth with an expression carefully arranged between authority and unease. "It should have been sealed. No one has entered it in years." "Yet someone did," replied Miss Marple gently. The Reverend hesitated, as though the simplicity of her observation contained something uncomfortably precise. "Yes," he admitted, "and that is what troubles us." Outside, the village resumed its uneasy rhythm. A milk cart passed too slowly. A dog barked once and then stopped abruptly, as though reconsidering. Even the usual chatter between neighbors felt muted, replaced by brief glances and unfinished sentences. Miss Marple rose later that morning and took a slow walk along Blackthorn Lane. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, marsh birds called with thin, uncertain cries. The lane itself seemed unchanged at first glance. Familiar hedgerows, uneven stones, the occasional leaning gate. Yet Miss Marple noticed what others did not: the way people avoided walking too close to one particular stretch of wall, as though the ground itself carried memory. At the bend where the lane narrowed toward the marsh road, she paused. There were footprints, not many, faint now, softened by the drying earth, but still visible to a careful eye. They led toward the Vale cottage and then away again, as though someone had approached, hesitated, and retreated in uncertainty or fear. Miss Marple studied them quietly. "They are not frightened of the cottage," she murmured to herself. "They are frightened of what it reminds them of." A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You won't find anything there now." She turned slightly. It was Thomas Reed, the village handyman, standing a few paces away with his cap in his hands. His boots were still damp, his expression carefully neutral, in the way of men accustomed to being judged before they have spoken. "I wasn't looking for anything," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Everyone is." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying the distant scent of marsh water. "You were there last night," Miss Marple said at last. It was not a question. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I was called with the others." "But you were not surprised," she observed softly. Something flickered in his expression, irritation perhaps, or fear of being understood too quickly. "I'm not surprised by much in this village anymore," he said. "That's the problem." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging a statement she intended to examine later. "And the cottage?" she asked. He hesitated. "That place has been wrong for years," he muttered, "locked or not." Before she could reply, he turned away abruptly, walking faster than necessary down the lane, as if distance might dissolve implication. Miss Marple watched him go. People rarely fled from questions unless they had already answered them in their own minds. By midday, the village was alive with restrained speculation. Not gossip exactly, something more cautious, more disciplined. The kind of conversation that pretends not to be imagination. At the post office, Mrs. Ellis spoke in lowered tones to two customers. "I saw a light myself," she insisted. "Just once. Weeks ago, not last night." "That's impossible," one woman replied. "Is it?" Mrs. Ellis said sharply. "Then explain who lit it." No one could. At the vicarage, Reverend Ashcombe received Miss Marple briefly in his study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and extinguished candles. He remained standing throughout their conversation, as though sitting might imply permanence. "I knew Eleanor Vale," he said suddenly, almost against his will. Before everything. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She was not unstable, he continued. Not as people later claimed. She was observant, too observant for her own comfort. And her son? Miss Marple asked quietly. A shadow passed over his face, subtle but unmistakable. A tragic accident, he said too quickly. Miss Marple looked at him for a moment longer than politeness required. Yes, she said softly. That is often the most convenient word. His fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. When she left the vicarage, the wind had begun to rise again, carrying with it a thin, unsettled chill. It was then she saw her, a woman standing at the far end of the churchyard path. Dressed in a plain dark coat, her posture composed, almost fragile. She was not young, but there was a quiet elegance in the way she held herself, as though she had long ago learned to exist without drawing attention. Beatrice Pembroke. Miss Marple observed her without moving closer. The woman was looking not at the church but at the ground beside it, where wet earth met old stone, and then, unexpectedly, Beatrice bent slightly and folded a piece of paper in her hands, not neatly, not consciously, into a small, imperfect shape, a boat. She held it for a moment longer than necessary. Then, as though realizing she was being watched, she looked up. Their eyes met across the distance. For a fraction of a second, something unguarded passed across Beatrice's face. Not recognition, but disturbance. A flicker of emotion that did not belong to the present moment. Then, it vanished. She turned away and walked toward the lane leading back to the village. Miss Marple remained still. A habit, she thought, is never meaningless, only unexamined. That evening, news came from Constable Reeves. Adrian Pembroke's belongings had been examined more carefully. Nothing unusual had been found, except for a faint trace of lavender on the lining of his coat, as though he had stood too long near something fragrant. Or someone, the constable added reluctantly. Miss Marple said nothing at first. Instead, she asked a simple question. Who was responsible for the cottage's keys? Reeves hesitated. There were no keys, he said. A silence followed that was not entirely comfortable. No keys at all? Miss Marple repeated gently. They were lost years ago, he admitted. At least, that is what we were told. Miss Marple looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. Then she said, almost to herself, then someone never needed to unlock the door. Reeves frowned. What do you mean? But Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because at that precise moment, a memory had begun to form, not of facts, but of behavior. The way people in Blackthorn Hollow avoided certain words too quickly, the way they corrected each other too eagerly, the way grief, when spoken of Eleanor Vale, always arrived already shaped into conclusion, and most telling of all, the way no one had ever described what they saw inside the cottage after it was opened, only what they feared they would see. Miss Marple rose slowly. I think, she said softly, that we have been asking the wrong question. Outside, the village bell struck 6, and in the fading light beyond the churchyard, Beatrice Pembroke stood once more at the edge of the lane, this time watching the cottage in the distance, as though waiting for it to remember something it had long refused to say aloud. Chapter 3. The Boy Who Drowned. By the third morning after the storm, Blackthorn Hollow had begun to speak in a lower register. Not silence, never silence in a village like this, but something more careful. Words were still exchanged at doors and over fences, yet each sentence seemed weighed before release, as though language itself had become slightly dangerous. The marsh wind had shifted overnight. It now moved inland, carrying with it a damp, mineral scent that clung to stone walls and window frames. Even the churchyard felt changed, the wet earth darker than it should have been, as though remembering something it would rather forget. Miss Marple walked there again just after breakfast. She noticed immediately that the villagers did not walk alone anymore. Where once there had been solitary errands and casual greetings, now people moved in pairs or small clusters, as if proximity might offer protection from interpretation. Even those who pretended not to be discussing the cottage found themselves walking in its general direction, then quickly choosing another route. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, rarely isolates. It gathers. At the edge of the churchyard path, she paused where the grass gave way to older ground, uneven, slightly sunken, marked by generations of unremarkable endings. A faint impression remained in the mud. Not footprints this time, but something more irregular. A disturbance, as though something had been dragged lightly across the surface long ago and never fully erased. She studied it without touching. Memory in villages, she thought, rarely vanished. It merely sank. Miss Marple? She turned. It was Reverend Ashcombe again, though he looked as if he had not slept. His collar was slightly askew, and his hands were clasped too tightly in front of him, as though holding himself together required effort. "I wondered if you might come inside," he said carefully. "There are matters that continue to trouble the parish." Miss Marple inclined her head and followed him into the vicarage. The room felt colder than before, not physically, but emotionally, as though the air had thinned of reassurance. Papers lay scattered across the desk, some clearly examined more than once, others left untouched as if they might contaminate curiosity. He hesitated before speaking. "There is something I should have clarified earlier," he said. Miss Marple waited. "The boy," he continued, voice lowering slightly, "Eleanor Vale's son, his death was not investigated in the way one might expect. That is often the case in small communities," Miss Marple replied gently. The Reverend flinched at the accuracy of her tone. "It was assumed to be an accident," he said quickly. "The Marshes are unforgiving. Children stray. It happens." "And yet," Miss Marple observed, "accidents rarely require so much agreement afterward." Silence settled between them. He moved to the window, looking out as though the garden might offer relief from thought. The rain had begun again, lightly this time, more suggestion than storm. "There were witnesses," he said at last. Miss Marple's attention sharpened slightly. "Two boys," he continued, "local. They were with him that afternoon. And what did they see?" The Reverend hesitated too long. "That is the difficulty," he admitted. "Their accounts did not align." Miss Marple said nothing, allowing the silence to do its work. Eventually he continued, almost reluctantly now, as if words were being drawn out of him rather than offered. "One said the boy slipped near the marsh edge. The other said he was pushed." A faint tightening in the room followed that sentence. "And which was believed?" Miss Marple asked. "The first," he said quickly, "the more reasonable explanation." Miss Marple looked down at her folded hands. "Yes," she said softly, "reasonable explanations tend to survive better." When she left the vicarage, the air outside felt heavier, as though the village itself had absorbed what was said and chosen not to exhale. She walked slowly toward the lane that led past the older cottages, where paint peeled in careful patterns and window boxes held flowers that looked as though they were being preserved rather than tended. It was there she saw Thomas Reed again. He was working near a collapsed fence, though his movements were distracted, repetitive, the work itself secondary to thought. When he noticed her, he paused only briefly before continuing, as if stopping would invite conversation he was not prepared to sustain. "You were at the marsh that day," Miss Marple said calmly. He did not look up immediately. "Everyone was at the marsh that day," he replied. "But not everyone remembers it the same way," she said. That made him stop. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. His expression carried a strain she had not seen before. Not fear exactly, but something closer to reluctant recognition. "You've been asking about the boy," he said. "I have been listening," Miss Marple corrected gently. A short, bitter sound escaped him, not quite laughter. "Listening is worse," he muttered. A gust of wind moved through the lane, bending the hedgerow slightly between them. After a moment, he spoke again, quieter now. "He didn't just fall," he said. Miss Marple did not interrupt. "There was shouting," Thomas continued, staring at the ground as though it might offer permission. "Near the waterline. I was further back, but I heard it." "And what did you hear?" He hesitated. "Adrian Pembroke was there," he said finally. The name seemed to hang in the air between them longer than expected. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her attention sharpened further, like a thread pulled quietly into alignment. "You are certain?" she asked. Thomas nodded once. "He was arguing with the boy's mother," he added. "Eleanor Vale." A faint stillness passed through Miss Marple. Not surprise, but arrangement. Pieces finding position. "And the boys who witnessed it?" she asked. Thomas's jaw tightened. "They were frightened," he said, "and boys remember fear more easily than truth." He turned away slightly, as though unwilling to continue standing in the same direction as memory. "There were things said afterward," he added reluctantly. "Warnings." From people who didn't usually involve themselves. "Which people?" Miss Marple asked softly. But he shook his head. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "In this village, some names are not repeated twice." Before she could respond, he stepped back toward his work, effectively ending the conversation. Yet Miss Marple did not move immediately. She watched him carefully, noting not what he said, but what he avoided. It was always avoidance, she knew, that revealed the strongest shape of truth. Later that afternoon, the parish records were brought to her attention almost accidentally, as though they had not been meant for her, but had simply found their way into her presence. Old ink, softened pages, careful handwriting preserved by habit more than intention. She turned them slowly, and then she stopped. A page had been partially removed, not torn carelessly, but extracted with deliberate precision. The edges were too clean, too controlled to be accidental damage. A missing entry, a missing moment. She looked up slightly, as though expecting explanation from the empty room. Instead, there was only the faint ticking of a distant clock and the muffled sound of rain returning to the village roofs. When Reverend Ashcombe returned and saw what she was holding, his expression changed before he spoke. "That page," he said quietly, "was removed years ago." "By whom?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "By instruction," he replied. "And from whom did the instruction come?" she pressed gently. The Reverend's voice lowered almost to nothing. "Adrian Pembroke." A silence followed that felt deeper than the room itself. Miss Marple closed the register slowly. "I see," she said. But she did not yet say what she saw, because understanding, she had learned, must be allowed to form fully before it is spoken aloud. That evening, as the light faded early behind thickening cloud, Miss Marple walked once more toward Blackthorn Lane. She did not need to hurry. The pattern was already beginning to reveal itself. And patterns, once visible, rarely forgave those who noticed them too late. At the far end of the lane, near where the marsh road began, she saw something that made her pause, a small object, half buried in wet earth. She bent carefully and lifted it. It was a child's drawing, faded, water-stained, but still legible in its crude lines. 3 figures stood beside the marsh. One was small, one was tall, and one, drawn in darker, heavier strokes than the others, stood slightly apart, watching. Miss Marple's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the paper, and for the first time since arriving in Blackthorn Hollow, she felt not uncertainty, but the quiet, unsettling shape of recognition beginning to form, because in the margin of the drawing, barely visible beneath smudged ink, was a name written carefully by a child who had not yet learned the importance of silence: Adrian. Chapter 4. The Woman in Gray. The drawing lay on Miss Marple's lap longer than it should have, not because it was complex, it was not, but because of the quiet insistence with which children record truth before they learn to disguise it. The marsh had been drawn as a simple, uneven smear of green and gray, the figures reduced to the essential grammar of childhood observation: tall, small, and something darker standing slightly apart, as though even in ink it preferred not to belong. By the time she reached the inn again, dusk had already begun to settle into the village like a familiar burden. Blackthorn Hollow in the evening did not darken so much as withdraw. Windows glowed softly behind curtains, and the narrow lanes between cottages became corridors of shadow and half-finished thought. Somewhere a door closed too carefully. Somewhere else a voice lowered mid-sentence. The drawing remained in Miss Marple's handbag, but its presence was no longer needed for her to feel its weight. At the inn, the atmosphere had changed again, subtly but unmistakably. Conversations were still happening, yet they now paused whenever a new arrival entered, as though every person carried the possibility of being implicated simply by association. Mrs. Ellis stood near the fire once more, though she did not speak immediately. When she finally did, it was with the cautious tone of someone testing the stability of words before trusting them fully. "They've taken more from the cottage," she said. "Taken?" someone asked. "Evidence," she replied, lowering her voice. "Or what they think is evidence." No one challenged her. No one confirmed her either. Miss Marple listened quietly from her usual seat by the window, where the last light of day stretched itself thin over the glass. She observed how people avoided looking directly at each other when the cottage was mentioned, as though eye contact might bind them to something irreversible. A pattern, she thought again. People who fear truth rarely avoid the truth itself. They avoid recognition of it in others. Later she walked alone. The village had settled into an uneasy rhythm of lamps and shadows. The wind had dropped, but the air remained charged with a damp expectancy, as though the storm had only retreated to observe from a distance. She did not go toward the cottage. Instead, she followed the lane that curved behind the churchyard and down toward the older boundary hedges, where the village began to loosen into marshland. The ground softened beneath her feet. The air grew cooler, carrying that faint metallic scent that always preceded open water. It was there she saw her again, the woman in gray. She was standing where the lane narrowed, partially obscured by the hedgerow, as though she had stepped out of the landscape rather than into it. Her coat was plain, her posture composed in a way that suggested long practice in being unnoticed. She was not young, but there was something restrained in her stillness, not fragility, but containment. Beatrice Pembroke. Miss Marple did not call out. She simply observed. The woman was not looking at Miss Marple. She was looking past her, toward the marsh beyond, where reeds shifted faintly even in the absence of wind. Then, unexpectedly, Beatrice moved, not toward the village, but slightly off the path, as though drawn by something habitual rather than deliberate. Her steps were careful, almost hesitant, yet not uncertain, the behavior of someone returning rather than arriving. Miss Marple followed at a distance. The marshland opened gradually, revealing itself in layers: water-darkened earth, brittle grasses, and shallow pools that reflected nothing clearly. The sound here changed. The village noises disappeared entirely, replaced by a low, continuous hush that felt older than language. Beatrice stopped near a cluster of reeds, and there, without hesitation, she bent and began folding something in her hands. Miss Marple recognized the motion immediately now. Paper. Again, the small boat. But this time, Beatrice did not release it immediately. She held it for several seconds, looking down at it with an expression that was not sadness exactly, but something more structured. Memory, attempting to arrange itself into tolerable form. "Miss Pembroke," Miss Marple said gently. Beatrice did not startle. That itself was revealing. She turned slowly. For a moment neither spoke. The marsh seemed to lean closer, as though listening. "I did not hear you," Beatrice said finally. "I did not wish to interrupt," Miss Marple replied. A faint, almost imperceptible tightening passed across Beatrice's face. Not irritation, but recognition of observation. "You have been asking questions," Beatrice said. "Only when people seem willing to answer them," Miss Marple replied softly. A pause. The paper boat in Beatrice's hands trembled slightly, though whether from wind or emotion was unclear. "You are staying with Mrs. Carter," Beatrice said. "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed. Another pause. "You are not from here," Beatrice added. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But villages are much the same, once you have seen enough of them." Something in that statement made Beatrice look at her more directly. "And what have you seen?" she asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the marsh, at the waterline where earth dissolved into reflectionless stillness. "I have seen," she said at last, "that people rarely remember events themselves. They remember the version that was easiest to live with afterward." Beatrice's fingers tightened around the paper boat. "That is not always a choice," she said quietly. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It is often encouraged." The silence that followed was heavier than before. A distant bird called once, then fell silent again, as though reconsidering. Beatrice looked down at the marsh water. "I used to come here when I was younger," she said suddenly. Miss Marple did not interrupt. "There was a boy," Beatrice continued. "He liked to race sticks along the water when the tide came in from the low channels." Her voice remained calm, but something underneath it had begun to fracture into smaller, less stable pieces. "He was always laughing," she said, "even when he shouldn't have been." Miss Marple watched her carefully now, not with urgency, but with patient attention, the kind one gives to something slowly surfacing. "And what happened to him?" she asked softly. Beatrice did not answer immediately. Instead, she lowered the paper boat and placed it gently on the surface of a shallow pool. It floated for a moment, unsteady, drifting slightly sideways before catching the faint current. "He drowned," Beatrice said at last. The words were simple, too simple, as though they had been repeated so many times they had lost their original weight. Miss Marple did not respond immediately. She observed Beatrice's face instead, the controlled expression, the careful neutrality that now felt less like composure and more like rehearsal. "And you were there," Miss Marple said gently. Beatrice did not deny it. That too was revealing. "I did not push him," Beatrice said after a moment, "if that is what you are thinking." "I am not thinking anything yet," Miss Marple replied calmly. A faint, almost bitter smile flickered across Beatrice's lips. "That is not what people usually say," she murmured. The paper boat drifted further into the reeds. Then, unexpectedly, Beatrice spoke again, lower now, as though the words had been kept sealed for too long. "My brother said it was an accident," she said. Miss Marple's attention sharpened slightly. "Your brother," she repeated. "Adrian," Beatrice confirmed. The name hung in the air differently here, away from the village, less like accusation, more like structure. "He always knew how things should be described," Beatrice continued quietly. "That was his talent, not truth, description." Miss Marple said nothing. Beatrice looked down at her hands. "He said if anyone spoke differently," she added, "no one would believe them anyway." A pause. Then, almost inaudibly, "And he was right." For a moment, the marsh seemed entirely still. Then Miss Marple asked, very gently, "Was he there that day?" So Beatrice did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the reeds where the paper boat had now become difficult to see, swallowed gradually by movement and distance. "Yes," she said at last. A single word, but it changed the air between them. Miss Marple studied her carefully. "And what did he do?" she asked. Beatrice's expression shifted then, not dramatically, but in a way that suggested something long contained had begun to press against its limits. "He said I would not be believed," she replied quietly, "because I was the one who was crying." A silence followed that felt different from the others, denser, more decisive. Miss Marple looked out across the marsh. The water had begun to darken with the approaching night, and somewhere beneath that still surface, she understood suddenly that the truth was not buried. It had simply been reclassified. And in that moment, as Beatrice Pembroke stood motionless beside the reeds, Miss Marple realized with quiet clarity that the village had not been protecting a secret for 20 years. It had been protecting a person, and that person had never been Eleanor Vale. Chapter 5. Inheritance and Ashes. By the 5th day, Blackthorn Hollow had begun to behave like a village that had decided, collectively and without discussion, to remember only half of what it knew. The mornings arrived pale and uncertain, as though even the sun hesitated before committing itself to the sky. Smoke rose in thin, reluctant columns from chimneys and dissolved quickly into a low ceiling of cloud. The marsh wind no longer carried storm violence, only persistence, a slow, damp pressure that seemed to lean gently against every door and window in the village. At the inn, conversation had shifted again, not toward the cottage this time, but around it, orbiting carefully, avoiding direct contact. Miss Marple noticed this immediately. People spoke instead of inheritance. Wills, property, old arrangements, legal ambiguities spoken of in lowered tones, as though paperwork itself might be listening. Mrs. Ellis was the first to say it openly. "There were always questions about Mr. Pembroke's work," she murmured while pouring tea for a customer she did not look at directly. "Not accusations, just questions." "Questions are dangerous things," replied someone near the fire. "Not when they are ignored," Mrs. Ellis said. Miss Marple sat by the window, observing the way the word ignored settled into the room without resistance. It was a familiar word in villages, a comfortable one, a word that allowed everything to continue. Later that morning, the solicitor's office was formally sealed by the constable, though in practice, it was already sealed by fear. Adrian Pembroke's presence, once woven through the village in neat legal lines, now seemed to linger only in absence, in the spaces where certainty had previously been provided too easily. Miss Marple walked there alone. The office was above a row of quiet shops, the kind that served the village more out of tradition than necessity. A brass plaque still shone faintly on the door, though the name it bore now felt less like identification and more like an accusation left too long unanswered. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old paper, and something else, not immediately identifiable, not unpleasant, but deliberate, lavender. She paused slightly, though her expression did not change. On the desk lay files arranged with meticulous care, too meticulous perhaps for a sudden death, as though someone had been interrupted mid-conclusion rather than mid-chaos. Miss Marple moved slowly through the room, not searching in the usual sense, but allowing attention to settle where it naturally wished to. People, she knew, often revealed themselves most clearly in what they chose to preserve. A drawer was slightly ajar. Inside, documents were stacked unevenly, some official, others personal. She lifted the top file carefully. Wills, property transfers, amendments, handwritten notes in a controlled, elegant script. Adrian Pembroke had not merely managed inheritances, he had shaped them, redirected them, reinterpreted them, a quiet kind of authority, exercised not through force, but through confidence in others' inability to question it. Miss Marple read slowly, her attention moving not just across words but between them. Patterns emerged, names that appeared too frequently in marginal notes. Beneficiaries shifted quietly in revised drafts. Signatures that felt slightly too uniform across different contexts. And then she saw it, a reference to Eleanor Vale, not as a client, not as a petitioner, but as a subject of legal guardianship. Her brows tightened almost imperceptibly. She turned the page. There it was again, a formal note. Mental incapacity confirmed, admission arranged through appropriate medical channels. There was no signature beneath it, only initials. A.P. Miss Marple closed the file slowly. So, the story of Eleanor Vale, carefully repeated through the village for 20 years, had not simply been a narrative of grief or instability. It had been constructed. Outside, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Miss Marple did not move immediately. The door opened. Beatrice Pembroke stood there. She looked paler than before, though not fragile. There was a steadiness to her now that felt less like calm and more like resignation, the kind that arrives when questions have already been answered internally, even if never spoken aloud. "You are not meant to be here," Beatrice said quietly. Miss Marple closed the drawer gently. "I am not certain anyone is meant to be anywhere in particular," she replied. A pause. Beatrice's eyes moved to the desk, to the open files. Her expression did not change immediately. Then, very softly, "You are reading his work." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "It is quite revealing." Beatrice stepped into the room slowly. The door remained open behind her, letting in a faint draft that moved the papers slightly. "He was very careful," Beatrice said. Miss Marple looked at her. "Yes," she agreed. "Careful people often are." Beatrice's gaze drifted to the files again. "You will not find what you think you will find," she said. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "I am not certain I am thinking in those terms yet," she replied. A faint tension passed between them. Not hostility, but something more complex. Two interpretations of the same landscape beginning to overlap. Beatrice moved closer to the desk. "He controlled everything," she said quietly. "That is what people do not understand. Not loudly, not obviously, but completely." Miss Marple did not interrupt. "He told people what had happened," Beatrice continued, "and then made sure there was no alternative version left to speak." Her fingers tightened briefly at her side. "And when someone did speak," she added, "he ensured they were not listened to." A silence followed. Miss Marple observed her carefully. "And your mother?" she asked gently. Beatrice's expression shifted, not sharply, but enough to suggest the question had landed somewhere precise. For a moment she did not answer. Then she believed him, Beatrice said simply. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly in thought, not suspicion, but alignment. "And you did not," she said. Beatrice gave a faint, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I was told I did," she replied. The sentence hung in the air longer than expected. Miss Marple regarded her steadily, "That is an interesting thing to be told," she said softly. Beatrice looked away briefly. From the window, the village could be seen below, quiet, ordered, unremarkable in appearance. Yet from this height, Miss Marple thought, one could almost imagine it as something carefully arranged rather than naturally grown. Beatrice spoke again, quieter now. "He said she would be taken care of," she said. That was his phrase. Miss Marple turned slightly toward her. "Taken care of," she repeated. "Yes." A pause. "And she was," Beatrice added, after a moment. "Just not by us." The words settled differently in the room. Miss Marple did not move immediately. Instead, she considered what had been said, and more importantly, what had not been. Beatrice's voice lowered further. "He said it was for her own safety," she continued, "that she was confused, that she had suffered loss and was no longer reliable." A faint tightening in Miss Marple's expression. "And the village accepted this," she said quietly. Beatrice gave a short, almost exhausted exhale. "The village always accepts what is easiest to carry," she replied. Outside, a bell rang somewhere in the distance. Not the church bell this time, but the smaller one from the post office, marking the hour with mechanical indifference. Miss Marple turned back to the desk. "You have been very patient," she said. Beatrice looked at her sharply. "I have had no choice," she replied. A pause. Then Miss Marple asked, very gently, "Did you ever see the documents he used to send her away?" Beatrice did not answer immediately. Her gaze drifted again to the files. Then, slowly, she spoke. "I saw him sign them," she said. A silence followed. Miss Marple remained still. "And you did nothing," she said softly. Beatrice's face tightened, not defensively, but as though absorbing the weight of something long contained. "I was told I would not be believed," she said again. The repetition now carried a different tone, not memory, structure, a learned truth. Miss Marple studied her carefully. "And you believed that," she said. Beatrice did not respond. The room felt smaller suddenly, as though the air itself had adjusted to accommodate implication. Miss Marple closed the file on the desk with quiet precision. "I think," she said at last, "that Mr. Pembroke did not merely manage the affairs of this village." She paused. "I think he authored them." Beatrice's breathing shifted slightly. Miss Marple looked toward the window again. "And I think," she continued softly, "that when people are told long enough that they are unreliable, they eventually begin to behave as though it might be true." A silence followed that was not empty, but full. Then Beatrice spoke, barely above a whisper. "Then what am I?" Miss Marple turned back to her slowly. For a moment, she did not answer. Because outside, in the village below, something subtle had changed again. A movement, a pattern, a recognition forming just beyond visibility. And Miss Marple realized, with quiet certainty, that the story of Blackthorn Hollow was not about a single death, or even a single deception. It was about the slow, deliberate rewriting of who was allowed to be believed at all. And as she looked at Beatrice Pembroke standing among the papers of her brother's life, she finally understood where the real absence in the village had always been, not Eleanor Vale, but truth itself. Chapter 6. The Locked Room. By the 6th day, the idea of certainty had begun to feel almost indecent in Blackthorn Hollow, not because certainty itself was unwelcome, but because it now seemed too heavy to carry. Conversations softened around its edges. Statements were shaped into suggestions. Even opinions arrived cautiously, as though afraid of being held accountable later. The cottage remained at the center of everything, and yet belonged nowhere in particular. Spoken of constantly, approached indirectly, never quite confronted. Miss Marple noticed this too. There was a difference, she thought, between secrecy and avoidance. Secrecy required effort. Avoidance required agreement. That morning, Constable Reeves arrived at the inn with the posture of a man who had not slept properly since the storm. "There is something you should see," he said quietly to Miss Marple. He did not elaborate further. She followed him without question. The path to the cottage felt shorter than before, though whether this was familiarity or dread accumulating into perception was difficult to say. The hedgerows no longer seemed merely overgrown. They appeared watchful, as though they had absorbed too many passing conversations and were now silently evaluating those who remained. At the cottage gate, Reeves hesitated briefly. "I do not like this place," he admitted under his breath. Miss Marple gave a small nod, not in agreement or disagreement, but acknowledgement. Few places, she knew, were disliked without reason. Inside, the sitting room had changed slightly since her first mental reconstruction of it. Objects had been moved for examination, yet the room still resisted clarity. Dust, disturbed but not fully erased, hung in uneven patterns across surfaces like reluctant memory. Reeves led her not toward the fireplace this time, but toward a narrow door at the rear of the room. "The cellar entrance," he said. Miss Marple studied it. The wood was old, reinforced in places, yet not as sealed as the village narrative had implied. The idea of a locked cottage, she realized, had likely been repeated so often it had replaced inspection. Reeves placed his hand on the latch. "It was not recorded properly in the original surveys," he muttered. "And yet, it exists." He pushed. The door opened with a low, complaining sound. Not resistance, but neglect. Cold air rose from below. Not the damp cold of earth alone, but something older, still undisturbed. They descended carefully. The staircase was narrow, uneven in places, worn by use rather than abandonment, which Miss Marple noted quietly, contradicted the story of total isolation the village had maintained for 2 decades. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a low space lined with stone and timber beams. And immediately the atmosphere changed, not visually, though the dim light revealed more detail than expected, but psychologically. The air here carried intention, presence, the unsettling impression that time had not fully stopped, but had been carefully managed. A single oil lamp sat on a small table, unlit, but recently used. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. Reeves followed, visibly uneasy. "This was not here yesterday," he said. Miss Marple said nothing at first. She observed instead. Shelves lined one wall. Not storage in the casual sense, but arrangement. Papers, books, and small objects, placed with deliberate order. A chair positioned facing the table. A blanket folded neatly despite the damp air. Someone had been here recently, and not in haste. Reeves moved closer to the shelves. "There are documents," he said, lifting one carefully. Miss Marple turned her attention. The paper was aged but preserved. Handwritten notes, letters, some official, some personal. The handwriting varied slightly, suggesting multiple contributors or careful imitation. But it was the subjects that mattered: Eleanor Vale, Adrian Pembroke, and beneath them repeated references to what was consistently described as the incident at the marsh. Miss Marple approached slowly. Reeves looked unsettled as he continued reading. "These are transcripts," he said uncertainly. "Accounts. Different versions." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Different versions of the same event," she corrected gently. He looked at her sharply. "You think they are fabricated?" he asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she took one of the letters carefully. The ink was faded but still legible. A woman's handwriting, not Eleanor Vale's, she suspected. Too steady, too controlled. The letter described confusion, fear, the difficulty of remembering precisely what had happened near the marsh, and then a sentence that stood apart from the rest. I was told I was not reliable, that I misunderstood what I saw. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her attention sharpened further. Reeves exhaled slowly. "This is unsettling," he admitted. Miss Marple turned the letter slightly. "Yes," she said softly, "it is meant to be." She moved further into the cellar. At the far end stood a second door, older than the first, reinforced, less used, but more carefully maintained. Reeves frowned. "This was not in the plan," he said. Miss Marple regarded it quietly. "No," she agreed. "It rarely is." The door was not locked. It opened easily. Beyond it was a narrow passage. Not natural, not accidental. A tunnel of sorts, carved with purpose, leading beneath the cottage and away toward the marsh side. Reeves hesitated. "This cannot be part of the original structure," he said. Miss Marple stepped forward. "It does not need to be original," she replied. "Only useful." They followed the passage slowly. The air grew colder, more controlled, as though the earth itself had been arranged to conceal movement rather than prevent it. At intervals, small alcoves appeared, shelves, hooks, remnants of use, not abandonment, but continuity. Then they reached a widening in the tunnel, a small chamber, and there Miss Marple stopped. A table stood at the center. On it, neatly arranged papers, ink, and a small wooden box. Reeves moved closer, then froze. Inside the box were photographs. He picked one up carefully. His hand trembled slightly. Miss Marple did not ask to see it. She already knew its significance by the way his expression changed. "It is him," Reeves said quietly. "Adrian Pembroke," Miss Marple confirmed. Reeves turned another photograph, then another, each one showing different angles of the same place, the marsh edge, and figures, a child, 2 adolescents, and Eleanor Vale. But in none of them did the scene feel accidental. It felt observed, recorded. Miss Marple stepped closer to the table, and then she saw it, a notebook open at the final page. The handwriting was Adrian Pembroke's, precise, controlled, almost elegant. Reeves leaned in slowly beside her and read aloud without meaning to. "Observation confirms reliability of narrative control. Subject responses can be redirected with sufficient authority." He stopped. Miss Marple did not move. The silence in the chamber thickened. Reeves looked at her, face pale. "What does that mean?" he whispered. Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because now the pattern was no longer fragmented. It was aligning. The cottage was not simply a place of concealment. The marsh was not simply an accident site. The village was not merely a witness. It was an experiment. She looked once more at the photographs, at the child, at Eleanor Vale, at the carefully arranged repetition of observation and control. And slowly, with the quiet inevitability of something long suspected becoming unavoidable, Miss Marple realized something that did not yet feel fully real. Adrian Pembroke had not only hidden what happened at the marsh, he had studied it, and worse than that, he had ensured that the entire village had been shaped to remember it exactly as he intended. Chapter 7. A Lifetime of Obedience. The passage beneath the cottage did not feel like a place abandoned by time. It felt like a place time had been instructed to avoid. As Miss Marple and Constable Reeves emerged from the tunnel chamber, the air behind them seemed to resist closure, as though the space itself did not wish to be left alone with what it contained. The lantern light trembled faintly against the stone walls, revealing marks that were not natural erosion but repetition, the subtle shaping of use, of passage, of memory reinforced through habit. Reeves said nothing for a long while. He had the expression of a man trying to reconcile two realities that refused to occupy the same space. Eventually, he spoke in a low voice. "If this is real," he said, "then everything we thought about this village—" He did not finish the sentence. Miss Marple walked slightly ahead of him now, her steps unhurried. She seemed less disturbed than thoughtful, though in truth, the difference between the two had become increasingly small. "Everything," she said gently, "is always real to someone." "That is not reassuring," he muttered. "No," she agreed. "It is not meant to be." They returned through the... When they reached the cottage cellar again, the air felt thinner, almost relieved to no longer be underground. The ordinary world above seemed suddenly fragile, as though it had been constructed on top of something far older and more deliberate. Reeves stepped out first. Miss Marple followed. The sitting room above them was unchanged, yet it no longer felt neutral. Every object now carried implication. The chair, the table, the faint trace of lavender in the air, all of it arranged not randomly, but with intention that had simply gone unnoticed for too long. Reeves ran a hand over his face. "We need to report this," he said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but not yet." He frowned. "Why not?" Miss Marple turned slightly toward the fireplace. "Because," she said softly, "people do not absorb sudden truths very well. They tend to reject them first, then distort them, and only much later accept what remains." Reeves did not respond immediately. Outside, a distant wind moved through the hedgerows. Then footsteps sounded at the cottage door. Both turned. Beatrice Pembroke stood there. She did not look surprised to see them emerging from the cottage. If anything, she looked as though she had been expecting this moment for longer than either of them had been aware. Her gaze moved briefly to Reeves, then settled on Miss Marple. "You have been inside," Beatrice said quietly. It was not a question. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." A pause followed. Reeves shifted uneasily but said nothing. Beatrice stepped inside. The door closed behind her without urgency. She looked around the room once, slowly, deliberately, as though confirming something she had already suspected, rather than discovering anything new. Then her eyes fell on the cellar door. "It is still there," she said. Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You knew about it," she observed gently. Beatrice did not deny it. "I was told not to use it," she replied. The phrasing was revealing. Not forbidden, not hidden, told. Miss Marple noticed the distinction immediately. "By your brother," she said softly. Beatrice's expression tightened slightly. "Yes," she said. A silence followed. Reeves looked between them, visibly struggling to understand the direction of the conversation. Beatrice walked slowly toward the center of the room. "He said it was safer that way," she continued, "that people would misunderstand if they saw too much." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And did you believe him?" Beatrice hesitated. "I believed," she said carefully, "that I did not have the right to disagree." The words hung in the air longer than expected. Miss Marple studied her. "That is not belief," she said gently. "That is instruction." Beatrice's gaze flickered briefly, not defensive, but unsettled by recognition. Outside, the wind shifted again. A subtle change in pressure, as though the landscape itself had adjusted its attention. Miss Marple moved slightly closer to Beatrice. "In the tunnel below," she said, "there are records, photographs, notes." Beatrice nodded once. "I know," she said quietly. Reeves stared at her. "You knew," he repeated. Beatrice looked at him for the first time directly. "I have known many things," she said. "That does not mean I was allowed to act on them." A faint silence followed. Miss Marple observed her carefully. "And your mother?" she asked softly. Beatrice's expression changed at once, not dramatically, but inwardly, as though the question had touched something carefully contained. "She was taken away," Beatrice said. Reeves stiffened slightly. "When?" he asked. Beatrice did not look at him. "After the boy died," she said. Miss Marple did not interrupt. "They said she was unstable," Beatrice continued, "that she was imagining things. That grief had altered her perception." Her voice remained steady, but something underneath it had begun to strain. "And you believed that too?" Miss Marple asked gently. Beatrice was silent for a moment. Then, "I was 13, she said. The simplicity of the answer made it heavier, not lighter. Reeves looked unsettled now. "But she was your mother," he said quietly. Beatrice's gaze lowered slightly. "She was also," she replied, "someone no one listened to anymore." A pause. Then she added, almost inaudibly, "After a while, even I stopped trying." The room felt smaller again. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the fireplace, as though considering not only words but structure, the architecture of belief itself. "And your brother," she said softly, ensured she was not heard. Beatrice did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was lower. "He said it was necessary," she replied, "that she was becoming disruptive." Miss Marple looked back at her. "And you accepted that?" Beatrice's lips tightened faintly. "I learned to accept what survived explanation," she said. A silence followed. Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "This is beyond anything we expected," he muttered. Miss Marple did not look at him. "It is not beyond expectation," she said softly. "It is only beyond acknowledgement." Beatrice moved slightly closer to the hearth. For the first time, she looked less composed, not breaking, but thinning, as though the structure that had held her for years was beginning to recognize its own fragility. "He kept everything," she said suddenly. Miss Marple turned her attention fully back to her. "Everything?" she repeated. Beatrice nodded. "Letters, statements, records of what people said, what they believed they saw." A pause. "And what they were told they saw," she added quietly. Reeves frowned. "What do you mean?" Beatrice looked at him directly. "I mean," she said, "that memory was not trusted unless it matched his version." A long silence followed. Then Miss Marple spoke very gently. "And if it did not match?" Beatrice's answer came without hesitation. "Then it was corrected." The word settled heavily in the room. Corrected, not dismissed, not denied. Corrected. Miss Marple's expression changed slightly. Not shock, but alignment. Another piece settling into place. She looked toward the cellar door again, then back at Beatrice. "You were part of it," she said softly. Beatrice did not deny it. "I was present," she said instead. A pause. "That is not the same thing," Miss Marple replied gently. Beatrice's eyes flickered. "No," she said quietly. "It is worse." Reeves looked increasingly uneasy. "This is turning into something larger," he said. Miss Marple did not respond immediately, because she had just realized something that altered the shape of everything that had come before. The village had not simply been misled, it had been trained. And Beatrice, standing in the dim light of the cottage, surrounded by the architecture of carefully preserved narrative, was not merely a witness to that training, she was one of its earliest subjects. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "And your brother," she said softly, "continued even after your mother was removed." Beatrice nodded once. "Yes," she said. A pause. Then, very quietly, Because there was no reason to stop. The words lingered, and in that moment, Miss Marple understood with quiet certainty that the marsh, the cottage, the locked room, the missing woman, the rewritten death of a child, none of it had been isolated events. They were stages, and the village of Blackthorn Hollow had not been a witness to them. It had been the instrument through which they were made believable. Miss Marple's voice was almost gentle when she finally spoke. "Then I think," she said softly, "we must now ask what else has been corrected." Beatrice looked up sharply, and for the first time since Miss Marple had met her, there was something like fear in her expression, not of discovery, but of what discovery might still remain buried beneath everything they had already begun to uncover. Chapter 8. Voices from the Marsh. The village had begun, by the 8th day, to behave as though it had accepted the presence of something it could no longer name. Not fear exactly, not acceptance either. Something quieter, like resignation wearing the clothes of routine. Blackthorn Hollow resumed its daily movements with careful precision. Milk delivered at the same hour, curtains drawn at the same angle, conversations held in tones that suggested everything was normal, provided no one looked too closely at what normal required. But nothing in the village was untouched anymore. Even the air felt edited. Miss Marple noticed this most clearly in the way people now paused before speaking Eleanor Vale's name, not to avoid it, but to ensure it came out correctly, as though pronunciation itself might be monitored. That morning, Beatrice Pembroke had not been seen, and yet her absence did not feel like disappearance. It felt like withdrawal, a deliberate step back from something already in motion. Miss Marple walked alone toward the marsh road. The earth was softer here, the boundary between land and water increasingly uncertain. Reeds shifted gently despite the absence of wind, and the water pooled in uneven shapes that reflected the sky without ever fully agreeing with it. There was a stillness in the landscape that did not feel natural. It felt maintained, as though something had once imposed order here and the land still remembered the instruction. She stopped near the edge, where the path dissolved into damp ground, and then she saw Beatrice, standing half in shadow beneath the reeds, as though she had been there longer than the morning itself. Miss Marple did not call out. She simply approached slowly. Beatrice turned at the sound of her steps, but not with surprise, only acknowledgement. "I thought you might come here," Beatrice said quietly. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "And why is that?" she asked. Beatrice looked out toward the marsh. "Because everything ends here," she replied. The words were not dramatic. They were observational. Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Or begins," she said gently. A faint pause followed. Beatrice did not respond immediately. Instead, she crouched slightly and touched the wet ground with her fingertips, as though confirming something tactile rather than emotional. "He used to bring me here," she said suddenly. Miss Marple did not interrupt. "Adrian," Beatrice added, though it was unnecessary. A silence followed. "He said it was important to understand places where people disappear," she continued. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "And did he understand them?" she asked softly. Beatrice gave a faint, almost imperceptible movement of her head. "He said understanding was not the point," she replied. "Control was." The wind shifted slightly across the marsh, not strong, but deliberate enough to move the reeds in a coordinated sway. Beatrice straightened slowly. "I have been thinking about what you said," she added. Miss Marple waited. "That everything was corrected," Beatrice continued. "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed gently. Beatrice looked at her now. "And if that is true," she said quietly, "then what was my mother corrected into?" The question hung in the air without urgency, but with weight. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the marsh, toward the place where narrative and geography had always overlapped in this village. "She was made into someone unreliable," she said softly at last, "so that anything she said could be safely ignored." Beatrice's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes," she said, "that is what I remember." A pause. "Or what I was told to remember," she added after a moment. Miss Marple turned her attention back to her. "And what do you believe now?" she asked. Beatrice hesitated. It was the first hesitation Miss Marple had seen in her that did not feel rehearsed. "I do not know," Beatrice admitted quietly. The honesty of it altered the air between them. For a moment neither spoke. Then Beatrice moved slightly closer to the water's edge. "I went back through it," she said. Miss Marple's gaze narrowed slightly. "The marsh?" she asked. Beatrice nodded. "In my mind," she clarified. A faint, almost sad expression passed across her face. "I tried to see it without his voice in it," she said. "Without what he told me I saw." Miss Marple remained still. "And?" she asked gently. Beatrice's voice lowered. "It does not stay separate," she said. A pause. Then, more quietly, "It overlaps." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "That is very telling," she said softly. Beatrice looked at her sharply. "How?" she asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she considered the way memory behaves in people who have been consistently told their perception is unreliable. The way it fractures not into lies, but into dependency. Finally she spoke. "Because," she said gently, "when someone else has been allowed to define your memories for long enough, your own begin to feel like trespass." Beatrice's expression tightened slightly at that, as though something inside her had been recognized without permission. A silence followed. Then, from further down the marsh path, a figure approached. Constable Reeves. He looked unsettled, as though he had walked here reluctantly and arrived already regretting it. "There you are," he said, though his tone suggested he was not certain why he had come. Miss Marple turned toward him. "What is it?" she asked gently. Reeves hesitated. "We have found something," he said. Beatrice straightened slightly. "What kind of something?" she asked. Reeves looked between them before answering. "Under the cottage," he said. "In the records we retrieved last night." He stopped briefly, as though choosing his words carefully. "There are references to other cases," he continued. "Other people." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Other people," she repeated. Reeves nodded. "Not deaths," he clarified quickly. "Not exactly, but disappearances, transfers, changes in identity in official records." A faint silence followed. Beatrice frowned slightly. "I do not understand," she said. Reeves exhaled slowly. "People who were here," he said, "and then were not. According to documentation, they were never here at all." The words settled heavily. Miss Marple looked down briefly, considering. Then she asked quietly, "And who managed those records?" Reeves did not hesitate. "Adrian Pembroke," he said. A pause followed. Then Beatrice spoke, very quietly. "That is not possible," she said. Reeves turned toward her. "It is written," he replied. Beatrice shook her head slightly. "No," she said again. "You do not understand." Her voice had changed now, less controlled, less certain. Miss Marple watched her carefully. "Then help us understand," she said gently. Beatrice hesitated, then almost reluctantly. "He did not keep records to record truth," she said. "He kept them to decide what truth would be allowed to remain." A silence followed. Reeves looked increasingly disturbed. "That is not how records work," he muttered. Beatrice turned toward him sharply. "That is how he worked," she said. The wind moved again across the marsh, this time stronger, as though the landscape itself had reacted to the words spoken. Miss Marple stepped slightly closer to Beatrice. "And your mother?" she asked softly. Beatrice's expression shifted immediately, not in confusion, in recognition. A long silence followed. Then she said, almost inaudibly, "She was not removed because she was unstable." Miss Marple did not interrupt. Beatrice's voice lowered further. "She was removed because she began correcting him." A stillness followed that felt different from all previous silences, heavier, more final. Reeves stared at her. "Correcting him?" he repeated. Beatrice nodded once. "She said the boy did not drown the way he described," she said quietly. "She said she remembered something else." Miss Marple's attention sharpened fully now. "And what did she remember?" she asked. Beatrice did not answer immediately. Her gaze drifted toward the marsh water. Then she spoke, very softly, that Adrian was already there. A silence followed that seemed to press inward from all directions. Miss Marple did not move. Reeves looked unsettled. "That could mean anything," he said weakly. Beatrice turned toward him slowly. "No," she said. "It means exactly what it sounds like." Miss Marple looked out across the marsh again, and in that moment, something that had been forming beneath all previous understanding finally settled into place. Not fully yet, but enough, because if Eleanor Vale had been removed for speaking, and if Beatrice's mother had been silenced for correcting, then the marsh was not simply the site of an accident, or even a concealed crime. It was the place where truth itself had first been rewritten, and Miss Marple realized, with a stillness that was almost physical, that the question was no longer what had happened to the boy. The question was how many times it had been rewritten after he died. Chapter 9. Voices That Do Not Belong. The evening settled over Blackthorn Hollow with a strange reluctance, as though even dusk was uncertain about what version of the village it was meant to obscure. The light did not fade so much as thin, stretching itself across rooftops and hedgerows in pale, uncertain layers. Windows flickered on in scattered sequence, each one suggesting a different household still attempting normality, though normality now felt like a performance everyone had forgotten how to rehearse. Miss Marple returned slowly from the marsh path, her steps unhurried, her expression composed in the way of someone whose thoughts had already moved ahead of her body. Reeves walked beside her, though at a slight distance, as if instinctively aware that proximity to understanding carried its own discomfort. Beatrice Pembroke followed behind them without speaking. No one had agreed to return together, and yet none had separated. That, Miss Marple observed, was often how truth began to reorganize a community. At the edge of the village green, Reeves finally broke the silence. "I have requested access to the remaining parish documents," he said quietly. "If there are more alterations, more omissions, then we will find them." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "And if there are not," she asked gently. Reeves hesitated. "Then we have misinterpreted what we saw," he admitted. Beatrice gave a faint, almost humorless sound behind them. "You will not find that comforting," she said. Reeves turned slightly. "I would prefer certainty," he replied. Beatrice looked at him directly. "That is what he preferred as well," she said. The words landed without emphasis, but with clarity. They continued walking. The inn came into view, its windows glowing warmly against the encroaching dark. Inside, voices rose and fell in uneven patterns. Laughter, too measured to be natural. Conversation too careful to be spontaneous. Miss Marple paused briefly before entering. She always noticed thresholds, not physical ones but psychological ones. And this village, she reflected, had begun to accumulate too many. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The inn was fuller than before, though not louder. The increase in presence had not translated into ease. Instead, it had intensified the careful choreography of behavior, each person performing normality in slightly different ways, none entirely convincing. Mrs. Ellis looked up as they entered. Her expression tightened briefly at the sight of Beatrice, then smoothed again. "Tea?" she offered, too quickly. Beatrice did not answer. Miss Marple seated herself near the fire. Reeves remained standing. A small stack of documents lay on the table already, as though the room itself had been anticipating their arrival. Reeves stepped toward them immediately, breaking the fragile equilibrium of conversation. "These arrived from the church archives," he said. No one spoke. He opened the top folder. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. Then Miss Marple noticed it. The handwriting. Not Adrian Pembroke's. Different hand. Older ink. Carefully maintained records, but with a distinct interruption in tone, as though someone had inserted themselves into an existing narrative and attempted to preserve consistency without fully understanding its structure. Reeves scanned the page. "These are witness summaries," he said, "from the time of the boy's death." Beatrice's posture shifted slightly at the mention. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Reeves continued. "There were 4 statements originally recorded," he said, "but only 3 appear in the official archive." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "And the 4th?" she asked gently. Reeves turned the page. "It was marked as withdrawn," he said, "at the request of the solicitor." A silence followed. Mrs. Ellis, standing near the counter, spoke without meaning to interrupt. "Everything was always at his request," she murmured. Reeves looked up. "The 4th statement," he said slowly, "was made by Eleanor Vale." The room changed, not visibly, but perceptibly, as though something had been introduced that no longer allowed the previous arrangement of attention to remain intact. Miss Marple did not move. Beatrice, however, went still. Reeves continued reading. "She stated," he said carefully, "that her son did not simply fall." A pause. "That he was led." Another pause. "And that Adrian Pembroke was present at the time." Silence followed, a deeper silence than before. Mrs. Ellis looked down at her hands. Reeves swallowed slightly. "But the statement," he continued, "was later amended." Miss Marple looked at him. "By whom?" she asked softly. Reeves hesitated. "By Adrian Pembroke," he said. Beatrice exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple observed her carefully. Not surprise. Recognition. Reeves turned another page. "And then there is this," he said quietly. He hesitated before continuing. "The final note attached to the file states that Eleanor Vale was no longer considered a reliable witness due to progressive psychological instability." A pause. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her attention deepened further. "And who made that determination?" she asked. Reeves did not answer immediately. "Then, the village doctor," he said. A silence followed. Beatrice spoke quietly. "There was no such diagnosis," she said. Reeves looked at her sharply. "It is written here," he replied. Beatrice shook her head slightly. "That is not what happened," she said. Miss Marple turned toward her. "What did happen?" she asked gently. Beatrice hesitated. For the first time since Miss Marple had known her, she looked uncertain, not in memory, but in permission to speak it. Then she said, "She did not become unstable," she said quietly. "She became specific." A silence followed. Reeves frowned. "Specific?" he repeated. Beatrice nodded faintly. She remembered details others preferred to blur, she said. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "And Adrian Pembroke," she said softly, "did not tolerate detail that contradicted him." Beatrice looked at her directly. "No," she said quietly. "He corrected it." The word again. corrected. It now carried weight beyond language. Reeves rubbed his forehead slightly. "This is becoming impossible," he muttered. Miss Marple did not look at him. Instead, she was watching Beatrice, because something had changed in her expression again. Not emotional, but structural, as though a previously held boundary inside her mind had begun to loosen under sustained pressure. Beatrice spoke again, more quietly now. "I remember something else," she said. The room fell still. Miss Marple did not interrupt. Beatrice continued. "The night before the boy died," she said slowly, "my brother came home late." A pause. "He was wet," she added. Reeves frowned. "From the marsh?" he asked. Beatrice shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "From something else." A silence followed. Miss Marple's attention sharpened further. "And what else?" she asked softly. Beatrice hesitated. "Then, he was not alone," she said. A pause. Reeves looked up sharply. "Who was with him?" he asked. Beatrice did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the inn window, where the reflections of the room flickered faintly in the glass. Then she said, very quietly, "The boy." Silence followed. Reeves blinked. "That is impossible," he said. Beatrice turned back to him. "No," she said. "It is what I was told not to say." Miss Marple remained very still, because now the structure was shifting again, not toward confusion, but toward convergence. She looked at Beatrice carefully. "And when you say he was with the boy," she asked gently, "what exactly do you mean?" Beatrice hesitated. Then almost reluctantly, "I mean," she said quietly, "that Adrian brought him back." A silence followed that felt heavier than any before it. Reeves stared at her. "That child drowned," he said firmly. Beatrice shook her head. "No," she said softly. "That is what was written afterward." Miss Marple did not move, but inside her mind, something finally aligned with a quiet, devastating precision. Because if Eleanor Vale had been silenced for remembering too clearly, and Beatrice's mother for correcting, then this was not a story of a boy who drowned and was later misrepresented. It was something far more controlled, far more deliberate, and Miss Marple realized, with a stillness that carried no comfort, only clarity, that the boy at the marsh had not simply died once. He had been rewritten so many times that even his death had become negotiable. Chapter 10. The Door That Was Never Locked. The night that followed did not arrive so much as settle. Slowly, deliberately, over Blackthorn Hollow, like something careful choosing where to rest after a long journey. There was no storm now, no restless wind. Only a damp, even stillness that pressed gently against windows and hedgerows, softening edges rather than sharpening them. The village lights appeared one by one, not with comfort, but with hesitation, as though each household required a private negotiation before allowing illumination. Inside the inn, no one spoke loudly anymore. Even silence had become something curated. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her hands folded in her lap with their familiar composure, though her attention was no longer in the room. It was elsewhere now, distributed across the village, across the marsh, across years that had been carefully rearranged into something believable. Beatrice Pembroke stood by the window. Reeves remained near the door, rigid, as though uncertain whether he was guarding the room or himself. No one had spoken for several minutes when Miss Marple finally said, very gently, "I think," she began, "we now understand what happened at the marsh." No one interrupted. She did not look at any of them directly at first. Instead, her gaze rested on the fire, steady, controlled, as though it provided a neutral surface on which truth might safely be placed. "It is always tempting," she continued softly, "to begin with the question of what was done, but in this case, that question has been carefully disguised by another, What was allowed to be remembered? A faint silence followed. Reeves shifted slightly. Beatrice did not move. Miss Marple continued. "We have been dealing," she said, "not with a single event, but with a series of revisions of that event, each revision more acceptable than the last, each one removing a small piece of discomfort until what remained was something the village could live beside." She paused. "And something one man could control." At that, Beatrice's fingers tightened faintly against the edge of the windowsill. Miss Marple turned her head slightly toward her. "Your brother," she said softly, "was not merely a solicitor." A pause. "He was an editor." The word hung in the air differently than the others had. Reeves frowned slightly. "An editor?" he repeated. Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes," she said, "of memory, of record, of consequence." She finally looked toward the table where the documents had been laid out days before. "Everything we have seen," she continued, "supports a single pattern. Whenever a version of events appeared that introduced uncertainty about his role, it was corrected, not erased in panic. That would suggest fear, but adjusted with care, with confidence." Her gaze softened slightly. "With authority." Beatrice closed her eyes briefly. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "That is not the behavior of someone hiding a single crime," she said. "It is the behavior of someone shaping reality so that crime becomes unnecessary to explain it all." A pause. Reeves exhaled slowly. "I still do not understand," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "That is because you are still thinking in terms of a single moment," she replied. "A drowning, a confrontation, a tragedy." She paused again. "But what if that moment was not the beginning?" The room grew still. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Miss Marple continued. "The boy did not simply drown," she said softly, "and he was not simply witnessed by confused children or grieving adults. He was part of a sequence of events that required interpretation. And interpretation, in this village, was never neutral." She looked toward Beatrice now. "You said he was brought back," she said gently. Beatrice did not open her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. Reeves stiffened slightly. Miss Marple continued, her tone unchanged. "Then, let us examine what that means," she said. She folded her hands more tightly in her lap. "Two boys saw something near the marsh," she said, "but their accounts were divided. One saw an accident, the other saw interference. That division was not resolved, it was managed." A pause. Then Eleanor Vale offered a version of events that aligned with what the second boy saw. Her gaze sharpened slightly. "And that version was removed." Silence followed. Miss Marple's voice softened again. "Why?" she asked gently. "Not because it was untrue, but because it introduced instability." "Why?" She turned slightly toward Beatrice. "And instability," she said, "is something your brother could not tolerate in narrative." Reeves frowned. "You are saying he altered the record of a child's death?" he asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said, "I am saying he ensured that only one interpretation survived long enough to become memory." A pause. Beatrice finally spoke. "Why would he do that?" she asked quietly. It was not defensive. It was almost childlike in its directness. Miss Marple looked at her gently. "That," she said softly, "is the only question that matters." The room seemed to contract slightly around them. Then Miss Marple continued. "Because," she said, "control over narrative is most effective when it is mistaken for truth." She paused. "And because once people accept a version of events, they begin to defend it themselves." A faint stillness followed. Reeves spoke again, more quietly now. "And the cottage?" he asked. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "That," she said, "was never locked." A pause. "It was presented as locked." Her gaze shifted toward Beatrice. "Because a locked cottage suggests absence," she said gently, "and absence suggests conclusion." A small pause, but there was no conclusion. Beatrice opened her eyes slowly. Her expression had changed now, not dramatically, but decisively. Something had settled within her that had been resisting settlement for years. "You are saying," she said quietly, "that nothing was ever finished." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "I am saying," she replied, "that everything was kept open long enough to be reinterpreted." A long silence followed. Then Beatrice spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never stopped," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said gently, "he did not need to." Reeves looked between them, unsettled. "Then what happened to the boy?" he asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the fire again, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "The boy died," she said softly, "but not in a single, clean narrative." She paused. "He died in a moment that was ambiguous. And ambiguity, in the hands of someone like Adrian Pembroke, is not a problem. It is material." A silence followed. Miss Marple continued. "The village needed certainty," she said, "so certainty was provided." She looked at Beatrice again. "And those who resisted it," she added gently, "were reclassified." Beatrice's voice broke the silence. "My mother," she said quietly, "was one of them." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said. A pause. "And Eleanor Vale," she added softly, "was another." Reeves looked down. "And the child?" he asked again. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. "The child," she said, "became the foundation of everything that followed." She paused. "Because once a single version of his death was accepted," she continued, "everything else could be adjusted to match it." A silence followed that felt heavier than the others. Then Beatrice spoke, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "So what am I?" she asked. Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, but with understanding. "You are," she said gently, "someone who was taught to remember only what could be safely carried." Beatrice's breath caught slightly. "And when that became impossible," Miss Marple continued softly, "you began to carry it anyway." A long silence followed. Then, from the doorway, a sound, not sudden, not dramatic, just presence. Reeves turned and froze. Adrian Pembroke stood there, or rather, what remained of him in memory, reputation, and the carefully constructed shape of authority that had defined the village for decades. He looked exactly as people remembered him. Composed, measured, controlled. But Miss Marple did not react with surprise. She only observed, because appearances, she knew, were often the last layer to be dismantled. Adrian smiled faintly. "I expected this," he said calmly. His voice carried no urgency, only confirmation. Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "No," she said gently. "You expected that no one would reach this point." A faint pause. Adrian's gaze shifted slightly toward Beatrice. "You were always the difficult variable," he said softly. Beatrice did not respond. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "That," she said, "is where you misunderstood your own design." Adrian frowned slightly. Miss Marple continued. "You believed," she said gently, "that control over information meant control over truth." A pause. "But truth is not something that depends on permission to exist." Silence followed. Adrian's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. "You did not merely rewrite events," she said softly. "You rewrote people's permission to doubt them." A pause. And that is why it worked. Adrian's gaze flickered briefly. Miss Marple's voice softened further, but only for as long as no one stepped outside the pattern. She looked at Beatrice, and she did, she said gently. Beatrice's breath was shallow now, but steady. Adrian turned his attention fully toward her. For the first time, something in his composure fractured, not dramatically, but enough to reveal strain beneath structure. "You were not meant to question it," he said quietly. Beatrice looked at him, and for the first time, her voice held something that was not instruction. It held choice. "I did," she said. A silence followed. Not empty, final. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And that," she said gently, "is where everything changes." Outside, the village bell struck midnight. A single sound, clean, uninterpreted. And in that moment, Blackthorn Hollow no longer felt like a place holding a secret. It felt like a place finally being allowed to stop maintaining one. Epilogue: The Quiet After Truth. In the days that followed, there was no dramatic unraveling, no single moment of collective collapse. Instead, there was a slow, almost respectful quietness, as though the village itself had decided to sit with what it had learned before deciding what to become next. Some records were corrected, some were removed, some were left untouched, not out of denial but exhaustion. The cottage at the edge of Blackthorn Lane was eventually opened fully, not as a place of fear, but as a place of uncomfortable clarity. Miss Marple did not remain long after that. On her final morning in Blackthorn Hollow, she stood briefly by the marsh. The water was still, unremarkable, and yet no longer innocent. Reeves walked beside her for a time without speaking. Then he said quietly, "Do you think it will be believed?" Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "I think," she said gently, "that belief is not the correct word." A pause. "I think," she added, "it will simply no longer be possible to maintain the alternative." She turned slightly toward the marsh one last time, and then, almost to herself, "Villages do not change quickly," she said softly, "but they do change when they are no longer able to forget correctly." Behind them, Blackthorn Hollow continued its day, not healed, not whole, but for the first time in a very long while, no longer edited.